So France just made an incredibly significant strategic move against Russia that largely went unnoticed. And I don't really blame people for not noticing this because, to put it mildly, there has just been a lot going on lately when it comes to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Nevertheless, this was a big update, and I think if it would have happened in a previous news cycle, it could have been the top story for quite a while, because it has broad sweeping implications. In fact, it doesn't just show us big updates for the immediate term, though it does. It also shows us how the calculus concerning Ukraine has completely changed over the past year. And we're increasingly seeing countries not just trying to help Ukraine win their war against Russia, although they are, but it actually seems more like countries are positioning themselves for a future where Ukraine has already won the war. They want to be in Ukraine's sphere rather than having Ukraine in their sphere, and I'll explain all of that a little bit later in this video. First, I should describe this actual update itself, and that came in the form of several agreements signed between France and Ukraine just a couple of days ago. These were agreements for weapons procurement, but most importantly, weapons production, where Ukraine would be producing French weapons on Ukrainian soil. And to be clear, this didn't just happen with France. There were also similar agreements reached with other countries or in the process of being reached with other countries like the United States. And it's a big update because it actually shows a shift in the way that everybody is approaching aid to Ukraine. First and foremost, there is a shift in the type of equipment that Ukraine is now getting. Earlier in the war, Ukraine basically had to beg for help, and what they got was often the dregs from other countries. For example, they would receive equipment that was about to be decommissioned anyways. Equipment that countries literally would have had to pay to get rid of. So why not just give it to Ukraine and accomplish a strategic objective at the same time? That was still helpful. That helped Ukraine out a lot. But typically this was equipment that was last generation or even several generations old. Not so much anymore. We're now seeing with these new agreements with France, and again with other countries, but France is just the biggest and best example, that Ukraine is getting access to the top-of-the-line new stuff that is the best in class. And again, they're not just getting access to the weapon systems themselves in small quantities, although they are for the immediate term, but more significantly, they're being given permission to produce these weapon systems for themselves. Now, I've seen that framed by a lot of people as if it's a negative for Ukraine, because it's only thinking about the immediate term. When people are thinking about what Ukraine needs today, it's disappointing if Ukraine is given a license to produce equipment that they probably won't have access to for a minimum of 12 months, if not 2 to 4 years. But I think that misses the bigger picture. When people are giving Ukraine access to produce equipment that they won't have access to for 2 to 4 years, there is an implicit assumption that Ukraine will still be here in 2 to 4 years. And not only will they be here, they will still be a significant power. People are preparing for the end of the war, and as they prepare for the end of the war, they're preparing for an end where Ukraine comes out on top. But at the same time, some of Ukraine's immediate gaps are getting at least partially plugged right now by some of these agreements. What we're seeing right now is just further proof of a potential future that I've talked about on this channel a lot. A future where Ukraine comes out of this war as one of the most important, if not the most important, arms suppliers on the planet. And more countries are now trying to establish mutual interdependencies between themselves and Ukraine, likely to ensure that they have access to Ukraine's soft power, but also to ensure that they have access to Ukraine's own innovative technologies in the warfare of the future. This is a smart choice because Ukraine has come a long way, from requiring tons of aid early on in the war to now producing 10 million of their own drones every single year, when most people said that Ukraine could never even produce 1 million drones on their own. But that 10 million figure is probably going to be doubled to 20 million, according to President Zelensky of Ukraine. A lot has changed, so in today's video I want to talk about those implications, but I also want to talk about all of the cool new gadgets that Ukraine will soon have access to. A lot to get into right after today's sponsor. We've been talking a lot lately about how the Russian military has been slowed down, if not completely stopped, due to logistics failures. They simply can't get all the stuff they need where they need it to go. But warfare is not the only place where you can experience a logistics failure. In fact, I would bet that everyone watching this video has experienced a logistics failure for themselves while you're on vacation. You know the feeling. You're traveling and you want to be prepared, so you pack all of the bags. But then you realize you have to lug this stuff around, and your relaxing time off has just become a part-time job managing luggage, shoving it in the car, checking it at the airport, carrying it around from place to place. This might be a much smaller problem than Russia's logistics nightmare, but it's still a real problem nonetheless, and it's not just a minor inconvenience. But luckily, there is a solution, a way to consolidate all the stuff you want to travel with into way less space. And that solution is the DOAC Travel Pack Vacuum Kit from Exter, the sponsor of today's video. I will never travel without this thing again. It allows me to pack 10 days or more worth of clothing into just my carry-on bag by compressing them in the DOAC anti-rip and waterproof vacuum bag. It's super easy to pack everything using the large side opening, and then you just compress it all in seconds using Exter's handheld, travel-size rechargeable air pump. Genius. If you want to try this out for yourself, just click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, and use my code WARBURG. That code will give you 10% off a DOAC vacuum kit at regular retail price, plus an additional 10% off the rest of your order, on top of any existing site-wide promotions. Plus, Exter also offers a 100-day money-back guarantee, meaning there's absolutely no risk to trying it out and seeing the quality for yourself. So go try it out now, and thanks again to Exter for sponsoring today's video. So hopefully with that introduction, you can now appreciate the significance of the changes in the types of agreements that other countries are now reaching with Ukraine. Now I want to shift into the specifics of the agreements that France entered into with Ukraine, because the details here are juicy. There's a couple categories here. First of all, there's how France is helping Ukraine in the immediate to short-term future. And then there's how France is helping Ukraine with their long-term future. And they're helping Ukraine with several different categories of equipment. First, there's the air defenses to protect Ukraine, but then there's other categories of equipment that are actually better for offensive purposes, showing that France is increasingly confident to allow Ukraine, in fact, to empower Ukraine to do something that a lot of countries were afraid of a couple years ago, which is actually taking the fight to Russia, helping Ukraine literally take land back from Russia. We'll get into all of that, but let's start with the most immediate problem, which is air defenses. We've heard it a lot lately, but Zelensky has described Russian ballistic missiles as basically Putin's final argument. And the implication here is that when it comes to the defense of Ukraine, Russia is failing everywhere except for one area. Ukraine does not have enough interceptor missiles remaining to actually intercept the ballistic missiles that Russia can fire at them. And because of that, Russia can continue to damage Ukrainian cities, even if they can't do much damage on the front lines and actually, from a military standpoint, move forward very effectively. So first and foremost, a lot of these agreements that were signed in the past week were aimed towards eventually addressing that problem, and the agreements between France and Ukraine were no different. One piece of this is that France entered an agreement with several other countries to join a coalition to help Ukraine produce their own anti-ballistic missile system, the Freya system. And this is really significant because this system will replace the function of the Patriot missiles that Ukraine currently relies on from the United States to shoot down ballistic missiles. Now, they won't be exactly the same as the Patriot missiles, they won't be as expensive or as advanced, but that actually could work in Ukraine's favor. Because part of the problem with the Patriots is that they're so expensive and they're so difficult to produce that it's hard to have them in sufficient numbers. Ukraine is working on a scaled-down alternative, something they've already done with several other categories of weapons, and they've proven successful. We don't need one weapon to get every job done. Instead, we need a specific weapon to do a specific job at a lower per unit cost. It's really smart, and Ukraine has already made good advances in this. But they do require some help from outside countries to accelerate the process. And they're hoping to partner with countries like France so that France can help them, for example, with guidance systems or other things, but also with production so that Ukraine can get off the ground faster to fill their immediate needs, their immediate holes. That's a big deal, and there's speculation about how long this will take. Some say that it could happen in as little as 12 months, which isn't very long for Ukraine to have their own anti-ballistic missile system. And certainly with France and all of these other countries, it will happen sooner. In the meantime, though, France is also providing Ukraine with some SAMP-T systems. And this is basically France's own alternative to the Patriot missile system, a very expensive missile, but it can still get the job done as far as intercepting Russian ballistics. In the immediate term, France is giving Ukraine 2 additional SAMP-T systems, and Ukraine has said that they need about 25 of these systems to protect their entire country from Russian ballistics. But keep in mind that Ukraine also has some other systems that do a similar job. They don't just rely on the SAMP-T. At the same time, France is also committing to accelerate deliveries of the missiles for these systems, Aster 30 missiles, by October. Now, that's not tomorrow. It is a little bit of a lag, but it's also not forever away either. And so by October, Ukraine will have these 2 systems, which are enough to protect some very important targets and some more anti-ballistic missiles to go with those systems. But even more than that, and this is a theme, and I'll just keep repeating it as we go through the list, Ukraine is going to be able to manufacture these Aster 30 interceptor missiles themselves so that they can start to cover their own gaps when it comes to Russia attacking their cities every single night. Now, it's really significant that this is happening, and I'll mention right here, the United States is in talks to also provide Ukraine with the ability to manufacture Patriot missiles for themselves as well. It's really significant that Ukraine will have access to the ability to produce not only their own system, but also the system from France and the system from the United States. Because each system is going to have its own geopolitics involved, each system is going to have its own components involved, and it gives Ukraine redundancy for this very critical task. In the future, in 12 to 24 months, they'll be able to solve this problem in several different ways, and they'll have several different options to choose from. Also, with this bigger variety of systems, it's harder for Russia to overcome, and that's a theme I'll come back to a couple of different times. Where Russia now has to prepare, for example, their electronic warfare or their countermeasures, not just for one system that the Ukrainians are using, but for several different systems with different logic behind them. And so we have a lot of different philosophies for weapons all being used in Ukraine at the same time, whereas Russia just has one team to develop a response to all of these different weapons. That's going to be a big deal, and we see how France is helping Ukraine in the immediate term and also in the long term. So that's how France is helping Ukraine solve their biggest and really their only current major defensive gap. Let's also talk, though, about how France is giving Ukraine new offensive capabilities, or at least giving them offensive capabilities at a vastly increased scale. And this again is coming in the form of licenses to produce 2 major systems, which are Scalp systems and Hammer kits. I'll explain both of them. The Scalp missiles are actually really famous because early in the war, this was one of the best systems Ukraine had to actually do damage against the Russians offensively. They just didn't have very many of them. The Scalp missiles, for example, were responsible for Ukraine's destruction of the Black Sea headquarters, where they destroyed that headquarters for about $1 million for the missile, which was a really good return on investment. These are missiles that previously Ukraine was not even allowed to use to strike Russian targets on Russian territory, because people at that time were afraid of how the Russians would respond. Maybe, for example, they would retaliate against France if France allowed that to happen. Now that is long gone. Those days are long gone. And Ukraine now has a license to produce these missiles for themselves. Now, Ukraine has their own systems that can do similar jobs now, like the Flamingo missiles, and they're going to have their own ballistic missiles soon. But having the Scalp in the picture in bigger quantities just means, again, more systems that Russia has to prepare for, more systems that Russia has to have responses to. And Ukraine can always find a gap where Russia hasn't prepared responses to every single one of their systems. That's big. But what's perhaps even bigger, potentially, is the Hammer kits. Because these Hammer kits will allow Ukraine to do something that has been very effective for Russia when they've done it to Ukraine. Because essentially what the Hammer kit is it's a system where you put wings on a dumb bomb, a cheap bomb, and the Hammer kit itself isn't all that expensive. It's like $100,000 to $150,000 US. And it allows Ukraine to fire these dumb bombs from distances that are outside of Russian air defense range. It's basically a glide bomb. And it will allow Ukraine to do what Russia has done to Ukraine. Where Russia is really their main effective strategy against Ukraine has been to use glide bombs that don't put their aircraft in danger, but that can cause a lot of devastation to Ukrainian frontline cities and Ukrainian frontline positions. Ukraine has recently been developing their own glide bombs, but now with a license to produce the hammer kits for themselves, again, it gives them more options. And if Ukraine ever wanted to go on the offensive against Russia, to a serious degree, these hammer kits would be one thing that would allow them to do it, to do exactly what the Russians have done and soften up the targets before they actually sent the rest of the military in. So this is a huge win for Ukraine. Now, all of this is very exciting, but what has really gotten my attention is France's decision to also give Ukraine their Rafale fighter jets. And this is a big move. Now, these jets are expected to hit the skies in Ukraine by 2028 or 2029, mainly because the pilots still need time to train. But these Rafale fighter jets, again, are different than anything that's ever happened for Ukraine before. Ukraine has received other fighter jets, the F-16s from the United States, but these were sort of last-generation fighters, whereas the Rafales are the best that France has. They're not just giving Ukraine old stuff that they have lying around. Instead, they are committing to Ukraine to supply them with their next-generation fighters as they're coming off, as they're being produced for the first time. And right now, France is going to provide Ukraine with estimates of up to 100 of these in the long term, but that number could change. And they're not the only ones pursuing this strategy. The same thing is going on with Sweden and their Gripen jets, which are expected to hit the skies by 2027, and right now something like 160 plus of these jets are ultimately expected to land in Ukraine. This is different. These are two countries with two next-generation fighters with different strengths and weaknesses who are actually competing for Ukraine's ultimate business. They're competing to see who can make up Ukraine's air force in the future, which is a much different posture than we've seen in the past. People wouldn't bother entering these agreements with a country they thought wasn't going to exist tomorrow. Instead, countries are making these agreements because they fully expect that Ukraine will set the meta for the next stage of modern warfare, and they want to be part of it. They want their systems to be part of it. So I want to unpack that just a little bit more now to really show you the overall geopolitical calculus that is happening with Ukraine and why I believe other key players, for example, the United States, who used to be resistant about Ukraine getting more of their weapon systems, are now getting excited and they're trying to actually outbid competitors to get their systems in Ukraine's hands. A great way to demonstrate the big picture point here isn't just to talk about the countries who are giving more to Ukraine than ever before, but also countries that are holding things back from Ukraine. For example, while other countries are giving their aircraft to Ukraine, Poland recently announced that they were going to be holding back their MiG-29 aircraft that they had planned to give to Ukraine. And the reason Poland is holding back is because they don't feel like they're getting enough of Ukraine's drone technology, which was, they say, their original understanding. Now, I'm not trying to get into the politics of all of that. My point is, Poland isn't giving Ukraine fighter jets because Ukraine isn't giving Poland their drones. And that shows you the exchange that is actually going on here between Ukraine and a lot of different countries. Similarly, around this time that the United States started talking about providing Ukraine with the ability to license to build Patriots on their own territory, Ukraine also started selling some of their drones to the United States. So we have an exchange of Ukraine's current technology for the systems that Ukraine can't currently produce for itself. And that shows us what countries are really trying to get out of Ukraine here. Now, that's obvious, I think, but it's always helpful to provide proof. Countries want Ukraine's drone technology because everybody increasingly believes that's how wars are going to be fought in the future, and Ukraine is way better equipped for that than anybody else. That was proven pretty recently in some war games with NATO, where Ukrainian drone teams wiped out like several NATO battalions in under an hour because other countries just are not prepared for this kind of warfare. They are realizing that more and more, and they're realizing that not only is Ukraine not as dependent on them anymore, but that if they enter into a big war, they're going to be dependent on Ukraine. And so they are now trying to get chips in play so that they have interdependencies. The idea here is that countries want Ukraine to need stuff from them that Ukraine can't make for itself, so that they have some leverage, or at least a relationship, a reason for Ukraine to continue providing drones to them. Now, that's not always unhealthy. That's how alliances work. It can be used in unhealthy ways, as we've seen from the United States, unfortunately, towards Ukraine. But now we see even the United States backpedaling because they realize they're not as dominant over Ukraine as they thought. Actually, Ukraine has a lot of cards. It's not to say the United States has no cards of their own, but both sides have cards and they need to trade their cards to each have a healthy society that's ready for the warfare of the future. This is a big shift for Ukraine. Ukraine is no longer dependent on others, or at least no longer solely dependent on others, but others have become dependent on Ukraine. And it's a really healthy development that Ukraine will now be able to license all of these systems. It's healthy for a couple reasons. First of all, it means that even if these licenses don't really fully come into play until after the war is already over, this is a big incentive, a big reason for Russia to not start a war again against Ukraine. Because if Russia does that, Ukraine will have just a massive arsenal with so much variety of weapons to take Russia down even faster, even better than they currently are. It's a very strong deterrent, probably the strongest deterrent possible against Russia ever attacking Ukraine again. And so the sooner we get this started, the better. It's also better, though, because it helps us, for example, if China ever decides to attack Taiwan. Because we have here, Ukraine has innovated a lot of new technology, but there's also going to be much more production capacity for very critical weapon systems that people traditionally just haven't had enough of. And in the center of all of that is going to be Ukraine. Ukraine might be licensing other people's technologies, but Ukraine is going to have a lot of production capacity. And that's going to keep these countries tied to Ukraine in ways that they never have been before. Ukraine will be taking a role that is very similar to the role that the former Soviet Union and Russia had, and also that the United States used to have, which is that Ukraine will hold power over other countries who depend on Ukraine for their weapons supplies. And that could bring Ukraine a lot of advantages. It's not just about the money they make directly from arms sales. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. It's really countries wanting to be good partners with Ukraine and be in Ukraine's good graces because they don't want to have a bad relationship if war ever comes. The United States used to understand that. This is part of the way the United States got so wealthy. We got a lot of agreements that were skewed in our favor because countries depended on us to supply their weapon systems. We were a little bit short-sighted with Ukraine, and we pulled weapon systems away from them with zero warning while they were in an active war. And now we're realizing that we have lost a lot of our power by doing that. And the country we've given that power to ultimately is probably going to be Ukraine. So this is a massive development. It's not just another aid package that we've seen happen over the past week or so. It's really a change in the geopolitical calculus as a whole, and it will change a lot more things below the surface that we can't even anticipate yet. Now, if you watched this far, I'm guessing and hoping that you enjoyed today's discussion. If that's the case, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. That just helps the video get more reach, and it also helps YouTube serve you more content just like this. Also, please consider becoming a YouTube channel member